The Quiet Boy, written by Nick Antosca, is the best Wendigo story I have ever read. Now, I love the Wendigo, however recently it feels as though every second piece of horror fiction I consume features the creature in some way. And it's kind of got to the point in which I'm almost disappointed whenever it shows up. So imagine my surprise when I found a story that is not only one of the best pieces of horror fiction I've read, but also features a take on the Wendigo that is so unique and refreshing that it rekindled my love for the creature. So if that sounds interesting to you, stick around to the end of the video so you can see why The Quiet Boy is not only one of the best stories I've read, but also unlike any Wendigo story you've heard before. Now, without further ado, let's get into The Quiet Boy by Nick Antosca. Julia was a 4th grade teacher, and it was almost like she was born for the job. She was both kind and patient, and she was still young enough to somewhat remember what it was like to be the age of her students. She looked out at her class and issued the day's assignment. All kids were required to write either a fairy tale, a tall tale, or a fable. She then asked what all these stories had in common. One boy quickly shot up his hand to answer. You could always tell the Ballard Creek kids from the Rexford kids. They were cleaner and more attentive, and although they weren't smarter per se, their parents cared enough about their education to make sure they did their homework. The boy had answered correctly, a beginning, a middle, and an end. The bell rung and all the kids immediately left for recess. Julia was about to get started on some work, however one kid had stayed behind. You could tell he was a Rexford boy from a mile off. Everyone in Rexford was poor, but Lucas was a special case. Lucas was frail, with dark hair and scabby hands that seemed to be never quite clean. He also wore the same pair of badly mended jeans every single day. Julia looked over his shoulder and she could tell that he was working on the day's assignment. However, he wasn't just writing his fairy tale. Each page was accompanied by an incredibly detailed illustration that looked like it had been done by someone way beyond Lucas's years. The boy was strange and quiet, and as far as she could tell, he didn't seem to have many friends. He always sort of moved away from people anytime they got close, almost as if he was worried he smelled bad. Julia noted that although it was true that Lucas did have a particular scent to him, it wasn't necessarily bad. He smelled like the outdoors and damp fur, kind of like when a dog gets caught out in rain. Julia had been curious about Lucas for a long time now and saw this as the perfect opportunity to get a peek behind the curtain and see what made this strange boy tick. She thought she better start off by asking something innocuous, and judging by his strange smell, she thought she already knew the answer. She asked if he had any pets. The question, although mundane, seemed to disturb Lucas as he quickly told her no. This only bolstered Julia's curiosity and she decided to pry a little deeper. However, Lucas was resistant to her subtle interrogation and would only answer in short replies. Despite his resistance, she was able to discern a few things. He lived with his father Frank and younger brother Todd. He also didn't mention anything about a mother, so she assumed she wasn't in the picture. Lucas finished another illustration. He quietly examined his work and then, without provocation, he became agitated. He then quickly stood up, tore up his paper, threw it in the trash can, and fled the classroom. Despite his abrupt exit, Julia had caught a glimpse of his face as he left. He looked ashamed. Julia had only been a teacher here for a few months, so she decided to ask around the teacher's lounge to see if they knew anything about Lucas. However, her questions were only met with a sympathetic laughter, almost as if there was an inside joke that she wasn't privy to. The teachers then started reminiscing on their own strange experiences with the boy. One teacher tells of a time in which he was at the local laundromat when he saw Lucas walk in carrying a big bundle of sheets. Suddenly, he then stripped down to his underpants before chucking everything in the machine. They all chuckled at this story except for Julia, who recalled Lucas's badly repaired jeans. It then occurred to her, and only her, that must be his only pair of clothes. The day ended and Julia went home, but not before fishing the remnants of Lucas's story out of the trash. And with only a little bit of tape, she was able to return the story to a semi-readable state. It was called The Three Wolves. Once upon a time, there was a family of wolves. Big Wolf, Middle Wolf, and Little Wolf. Every day, Middle Wolf would go out to the woods to get food for the family. However, one day he came back and Big Wolf and Little Wolf had caught rabies, and now all they wanted to do was go to town and eat people. Middle Wolf, wanting to protect the people of the town, blocked off the entrance to their cave, and every day he would slip them fresh meat to try and satisfy their hunger. However, they were always hungry, so he slept by the entrance to their cave to make sure that the wolves never got out. Lucas's drawings were good, but bizarre. Big Wolf had these strange eyes, and Middle Wolf had this weirdly human face. Normally for this assignment, kids just rewrote famous fairy tales, such as Beauty and the Beast or Jack and the Beanstalk, but not Lucas. Julia guessed that Big Wolf was meant to represent Frank, and Little Wolf was his younger brother Todd, and Middle Wolf was Lucas himself. Although the symbolism of the wolves was quite clear, Julia couldn't tell what the story meant. What did it mean that Big Wolf and Little Wolf had rabies? Her best guess was that maybe Frank was an alcoholic and Lucas was worried that his younger brother was taking up after him. Julia went to bed, however the story bounced around in her mind all night. She knew she wanted to rescue the boy, but she wasn't quite sure what she was trying to rescue him from. On her way to school the next morning, she decided to stop at a local Goodwill and pick up some children's clothes. When she gave them to Lucas, he was in disbelief. She then told Lucas that she was putting together an after-school art program if he was interested in joining. Lucas quickly agreed and Julia smiled. All she would need Lucas to do was to get his dad to sign a permission slip, and if at all possible, she would like to speak with him. Lucas's face dropped the moment she mentioned his father. He then told her that he had changed his mind and he was no longer interested. He then quickly packed up his things, then hurried out the door. She tried to talk to him again about it the next day, however Lucas was having none of it. No one at school had even seen Lucas's father, and she was becoming very concerned. She got Lucas's address from his file in the admin building, and despite her better judgment, she decided to pay his family a visit after school had ended for the day. Lucas lived on Perlmutter Road, which even for Rexford was run down. When she arrived, she was immediately struck by how unusually quiet the street was. The air was thick with this tension, almost like the street itself was waiting for something. At this point, she would have even preferred one of those angry dogs that would bark at people as they walked by, which was typical for Rexford. However, she could see or hear no dogs, or any animals at all for that matter. Lucas's house was immediately distinct from the others. Although it was far from the nicest neighborhood, the other houses at least had signs of life. But Lucas's house was different. The path to the front door had been entirely engulfed by weeds, and the windows had been boarded shut. She banged on the door, but there was no reply. Julia made her way over to a window, and after a moment of hesitation, she decided to peer through a crack in the boards. It took a moment for her eyes to adjust, but when they did, a sudden feeling of cold rushed over her. She could barely make it out, but in the room full of shadows, one looked like a man, and it was looking at her. She tried to convince herself that it was something like a coat hung on a door, but it had a slight sway to it, as if whoever it was slowly shifting their weight from side to side. She pulled back from the window. As soon as she looked away, she began to doubt herself. She wasn't sure whether she could believe that she actually had seen what she thought she had. Slowly, she steeled herself as she crept her eye back to the crack in the boards. Whatever that was, it was gone now, which only reinforced her doubts. She needed to find a better angle. She walked down off the porch and through the thick weeds that led to the backyard. Behind the house, she could see something big and blue. Upon closer inspection, she realized that it was a tent, and its flap was open. Inside, there were candy wrappers sitting on top of children's sheets, as well as several books that she recognized from the school's library. It was starting to make sense now. Lucas was living in a tent. She could hear talking coming from the street. At the end of the road, she saw two older boys from her school, as well as Lucas trailing behind them. The school bus had just arrived. Julia hid just before Lucas entered the backyard. From her hiding spot, she could see him bundle up his bedding as he started to make his way back down the road towards the local laundromat. Once she was sure he was gone, she made her way back to the car, and just before she was about to leave, she saw something move in the upstairs window. The silhouette in the window was much smaller than the one she saw earlier. It looked as though it was a child even younger than Lucas, and even though she may have imagined it, it looked as though it was sucking on its fingers. She remembered that Lucas had a younger brother. She walked back to the house and called Todd's name. She listened close, and although she got no reply, she could hear a faint sobbing coming from inside the house. She banged again, and although she couldn't tell what exactly, she knew that whatever was happening to that child in that house was bad, and that she wasn't going to leave without doing anything. She found an old rusted piece of metal in the long grass and started banging it against the lock. The wood of the door was half rotten and it gave way easily. She made her way inside, and immediately the crying stopped. And although she was expecting the house to be messy, inside it was far more disgusting than she thought. Every surface of the house was coated in grime, and the floor was completely covered in rat droppings. She entered the room in which she thought she had seen the child's silhouette, but no one was there. However, there was something more shocking. Inside the room, there was a table with a dark substance smeared across it. Upon closer inspection, it was a 5-pointed star, and at each point there was a drawing of an eye with a rectangular pupil like that of a goat. She didn't know what it was exactly, but she knew it was satanic. She regretted coming into the house and desperately wanted to flee. However, there was one room left to search. She walked up to the entryway, and without going in, she peered into the darkness. That's when she saw it. 2 rotting bodies. One belonged to a large man and the other belonged to a small child. The smell was awful. Whoever they were had been dead for a very long time. Suddenly, she felt a heavy presence behind her, as if whoever it was leaning over her shoulder. That's when she heard a voice say, "One more step." The second she heard the voice, she bolted out of the house and was more than halfway down the street before her phone finally got signal and she was able to call the police. The sheriff was a skinny man in his 40s. He exited the house and walked right up to Julia. At this point, probably half the police in town had showed up. The sheriff told her that it looked as though Frank had decided to kill himself and his son. There was a large box of rat poison opened by the bodies, so if he had to guess, it looks as though Frank had forced his younger son to eat some of the rat poison before eating some himself. Julia asked the sheriff why Lucas wouldn't report the bodies, but he just sighed. Apparently, it wasn't uncommon for cases like this. Kids in Rexford had heard stories about the foster system, many of which were true, and Lucas was probably just scared about entering it. The sheriff told Julia that he had sent a car around to pick up Lucas from the laundromat, so perhaps they could ask him when he got here. Julia then hesitantly asked about the shadows that she saw. Apparently they searched the entire house, but they couldn't find anyone. The only room they didn't search was in the basement, but the sheriff had placed his ear against the door and he said he couldn't hear anyone hiding inside. He told her that a locksmith was on his way, so she would know for sure soon. Lucas arrived in a squad car, and Julia strategically placed herself in front of him so he didn't have to see the men in white hazmat suits removing his father and brother from the house. Lucas looked panicked and asked what they were doing. Julia tried to ask Lucas how long he had been living like this, but Lucas wasn't responding. He just kept on pointing at the men in white suits carrying the 2 plastic bags, saying, "You can't do that." Julia's heart broke. No child should have to go through this. She looked him in the eyes and told him that everything was going to be alright and that she was going to be there for him. Comprehension flickered in Lucas's eyes, and he told her that he was scared. Julia asked the sheriff where Lucas was going to stay for the night. It was obviously a question he hadn't considered, and before he could even answer, Julia volunteered for Lucas to stay with her, and without a better option, the sheriff agreed. The whole car trip, Lucas was staring out the window. He was a strange boy, but now with the added context, everything made sense. What child wouldn't be? He kept on twisting in his seat. even occasionally looking out the back window as if he was looking for something. When they arrived, Julia set Lucas up on the couch and started playing a kids movie on her laptop, and unsure of what to do next, she decided to order 2 large pizzas. Looking at him again now, Lucas seemed more frail than ever. She sat down next to that quiet boy from her class and felt almost a motherly concern towards him as she looked at the bony frame that was peeking out through his clothes. Perhaps she should have taken him to the hospital. It probably would have been the smarter thing to do. However, it was too late now. The movie was getting good and pizza was on its way. She knew nothing was going to happen tonight, but she thought it would probably be best if she made some arrangements for tomorrow. The sheriff had given her his phone number in case of an emergency, but when he picked up, he was the one that seemed frantic. When she tried to bring up her concerns about the boy's health, she was dismissed with a "I'll handle it tomorrow." She asked the sheriff what was wrong, but he only answered with a vague, "Somebody got hurt." He told her that he needed to tell her something. The locksmith was able to get into the basement of Lucas's house, and it was filled entirely with dead animals. There were mostly dogs and cats, and many of them still had on collars. It looked as though they'd been tortured. The animals had been brutalized. It looked as though they'd been twisted around and around again, almost like when you try to wring water out of a towel. The animals were also fresh, far fresher than the 2 bodies in the house. The sheriff then told her that if she was uncomfortable with Lucas being in the house, she could drop him off at a nearby police station and they would sort it out. She looked towards that unassuming boy from her class and he was staring directly back at her. The only thing that lived in the silence between them was the chattering of her laptop. She recalled the smell of damp fur that followed Lucas around wherever he went, and how disturbed he looked when she asked him if he had any pets. She asked him if he knew anything about the animals in the basement, her voice catching in her throat as she did. He continued to stare at her. She asked again and again, but he was determined to not answer. He broke his gaze, but instead of returning it to the laptop, he was now staring out the window. She hurried into the kitchen to call the sheriff, and when he picked up, in the background there were screams of fresh grief. She asked what was going on, but the sheriff was fumbling over his words. He said that some people had been killed in Ballard Creek. The way he paused on the word killed gave Julia chills. It was almost like he had to think about it, as if the word wasn't adequate to explain what he was seeing. The line cut out and she looked at her phone. She had no service. She hadn't lost service before, but now it had happened twice in one day. Once at Lucas's and once now. Lucas was still looking out the window, but now he was gripping a couch cushion so hard that his knuckles had turned white. Suddenly a scream pierced the night. It was her neighbor Elaine. Julia rushed towards the door to go help, but Lucas cried for her to stop. It was lucky she did, because outside her window she saw movement. Something was in her yard. It looked like the silhouette of a small child. Julia recognized it immediately as the same figure she saw in the upstairs window at Lucas's house. Whatever it was, it looked like it was playing. Now that she was getting a closer look, something strange was coming out of the figure's head. Just above each of its temples, there was these bizarre growths that looked like tree branches or antlers. And just like when she saw it in that upstairs window, it was sucking on its fingers. The boy was now on all fours, hopping across the grass like a frog. The boy was playing, totally unfazed by the harrowing screams that were echoing from the neighbor's house. Julia desperately asked Lucas what that thing in her front yard was. Lucas responded sheepishly before saying, "It's Todd." Julia told Lucas solemnly that it couldn't be Todd because Todd was dead. Lucas went quiet before suddenly speaking up again. He said he knew. The little boy in the front yard had stopped its hopping and was now looking directly at the house. She could see its face. It was waxy and white, and its eyes were bulbous and crazy, and it was still sucking ravenously on its fingers. It turned to face the neighbors, and as it did, its face fell back into shadow, and Julia immediately doubted what she had just seen. Suddenly, a man walked out of her neighbor's house, and he was larger than anyone she had ever seen. The figure radiated malevolence, and she knew instinctually that whoever it was the one responsible for the voice she heard inside Lucas's house. It was close closer now, and on the top of its head was a set of antlers that looked like gnarled branches from an old oak tree. The figure approached the boy. However, when it stepped, its feet stopped just shy of the ground. It floated calmly towards the smaller figure, and when it reached it, it slowly outstretched its hand. The child started eating something out of the figure's hand. She didn't need to ask who that tall man in her garden was, because she already knew the answer. It was Lucas's father, Frank. The two silhouettes turned to face the house, and in the darkness, they looked like hateful statues. She asked Lucas what they wanted, but then she remembered the story he had written. Big Wolf and Little Wolf had rabies, and now all they wanted to do was go to town and eat people. But they didn't eat in the traditional sense. She could tell that whatever they were, they didn't eat meat. Instead, they ate pain. Lucas was crying. He said that his father had done something, so when they died, they would come back to life. However, what he didn't know was that if their bodies stayed in the house, they wouldn't be able to leave. She realized what this meant. Lucas was keeping them trapped in their cave, but she let them out. She wanted to blame Lucas for not warning her, but in her heart she knew that she wouldn't have believed him. Instead, she asked if there was anything they could do. He said they didn't like the light. However, anytime they got close to a light source, it seemed to flicker before going out. The figures were now approaching the house. The smaller one was taking these large, exaggerated steps, almost like he was mimicking a burglar from a Sunday morning cartoon. And a few paces behind him floated his father. If the lights were going to go out soon, they were going to need a flashlight, so Julia frantically searched until she found one. Then Lucas said something that broke her heart. He knew they wanted him, so he offered to leave so she could have a chance at living. She immediately told him to shut up. Despite how desperate their situation was, she wasn't going to sacrifice a child to save herself. She turned on the flashlight and it illuminated the entire room. Lucas's family was now pressed up against the glass and she could see their impossibly pale faces. They stared at her with strange eyes, with rectangular pupils, almost like that of a goat. They called for her to give them the boy, and their voices burnt like hot steam in her ears. Then suddenly, in the blink of an eye, they were in her house. She flashed her light at them, but it flickered and died. Dread filled her, and in her despair, the darkest parts of her revealed themselves. She was only moments away from pushing Lucas towards the monsters in a last-ditch effort to save herself when two bright headlights shone through her window. And just as quickly as they entered the house, they were gone. A car door slammed and she heard footsteps approaching her front door. It was the pizza delivery boy. She screamed at him to run, but she was too late. The moment the doorbell rung, they attacked, once again filling the night air with the horrible sound of screams. She could hear his bones breaking as they twisted him like bubble wrap. However, as awful as this sound was, it snapped her out of her daze. She grabbed Lucas and ran into the kitchen. She grabbed several large pots as well as a lighter. She then found some newspapers, tore them up into scraps and placed them in the pots. She then lit them on fire. The screams of the delivery boy were tapering off and she knew they were going to be back shortly. She only had 3 newspapers left and they were burning fast. In the darkness, she saw the figure of Todd. He was crouched on all fours as he approached her like a dog. Frank appeared in the doorway behind him. He ordered for her to push Lucas out into the light, and she looked down at the boy from her class and considered it. He was so frail and there was no way for him to resist her. They only wanted him, so if she gave him up, they would probably let her live. She placed her hands on his bony little frame, and he gazed up at her with eyes that contained no hate whatsoever. He understood what had to be done. She looked at Frank, his face looking swollen in the dull firelight. Their eyes met, and she slowly shook her head no. Nobody noticed when neither of them showed up for school the next day. 6 murders in one night in a town like this was almost unheard of. When one of the teachers eventually realized that Julia hadn't shown up for work, he decided to swing by her place on his way home. When he arrived, he didn't need to go in. The brutalized body of the pizza delivery boy was still left mangled on her front porch. In the end, it was the sheriff who found Julia's body. It was laying contorted on her kitchen floor. However, they were unable to find that quiet boy from her class. Now, that brings us to the end of the story, and I have to say, I personally love this depiction of the Wendigo. What I think The Quiet Boy does so well is it takes conventions surrounding the Wendigo and just makes these small little tweaks to them that gives the story significantly more depth. A notable example of this is the choice to blend beliefs about the Wendigo with Christian spirituality. Like, it is a Wendigo story through and through, however, throughout the entire thing, there's all these little nods and Easter eggs towards Christian spirituality, which I think is just super fun. An example of this would be the pentagram that Julia found in Lucas's house that had the goat's eyes at the end of each point. Also, whenever the Wendigos are seen clearly, Julia always makes some kind of remark about them having rectangular pupils, almost like that of a goat, which I think is a pretty clear parallel to depictions of Satan. Even though these are small details, I think they do a lot for the story, because at this point, everyone is so familiar with the concept of a Wendigo, but by adding these little breaks from convention, it makes them feel different and unpredictable, like these aren't the same Wendigos you're used to. I also really like how this story maintains the same core themes of the Wendigo whilst expressing them in new ways. Take for instance the theme of cannibalism. Instead of eating human flesh, these Wendigos eat human pain. Like, I think it's just a really fun and spooky idea of having these very intelligent, essentially torture monsters sneaking towards your house at night. Like, that's just a really cool image. I also really like this because in a lot of Wendigo stories, they're depicted as these mindless, rabid monsters that are driven by an insatiable hunger that causes them to act irrationally. And so I was really pleasantly surprised when this story kept that same theme of insatiable hunger, but instead these Wendigos acted in a way that was calm and intelligent. The way these Wendigos operated was so intentional and calculated that it built a really nice atmosphere of helplessness. They never once felt like mindless monsters. Take for instance the ending in which they're stalking Julia in her house. How much less scary would that scene be if instead of calmly approaching, they just decided to bum rush the door and kick it in, which is kind of what they did in the movie adaptation. I think I should quickly mention the movie. In 2021, the story was adapted into the movie Antlers, and the movie, it's alright, like, don't get me wrong. However, it's almost like they looked at the original story and then highlighted all the bits that made it different and unique, and for some reason just decided to delete them. For instance, instead of the curse originating from Frank's own hubris, he instead just gets infected by the spirit of the Wendigo when he was messing around in an abandoned mine. Which kind of just messes up the themes of the Wendigo, because in the original stories, people become a Wendigo after they engage in acts of great selfishness, such as cannibalism. Which in the original story, although Frank doesn't eat anyone, he does kill his 2 children in pursuit of immortality, which is arguably a very selfish thing to do. This is also another great example of how the original story takes themes of the Wendigo while expressing it in a new and interesting way. So I'm just confused as to why you would abandon this premise, which is thematically sound, and opt for making it so he just got like infected by the spirit of the Wendigo when he was making drugs in a mine. Like, maybe the concept of child murder was too heavy for mainstream audiences. However, you know, movies like The Hunger Games exist. Like, I think there's ways to pull it off. It's honestly kind of a bummer because there's so many moments that I think would play out really well on screen. Like, one of my favorite moments in the whole story is when Todd is like sneaking up on the house and he's on his tiptoes and he's taking these large exaggerated steps like he is a burglar from a Sunday morning cartoon. Also, the idea of Frank floating behind him is really cool because it's like he's supervising his child as he learns how to hunt. And it just creates this really menacing image because it's like he's so confident that Julia and Lucas are going to be able to do nothing to stop them, that he's okay with letting his literal 6-year-old take point. Anyway, I could rant about this story for an incredibly long time. However, it is already way longer than I was intending it to be, so I'm gonna have to wrap it up here. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing. It really does help me out. This channel actually just got monetized, which is huge, and I find it kind of difficult to express how grateful I am to all of you who have left nice comments and subscribed. Yeah, it's just been a dream come true, and I'm over the moon, really. As always, I recommend checking the story out for yourself, as well as some of Nick Antosca's other works. He is the showrunner for the TV show Channel Zero, which is a horror anthology that adapts famous creepypastas, which is really, really cool. I've just started that myself and I'm enjoying it so far. Also, let me know what you think of the green screen. As you can see, the Saints YouTube channel now has a budget and production is skyrocketing. Anyway, that's all from me, and I really look forward to seeing you in the next one.